Death came to the Harrow farm on a Tuesday, and with it, an impossible promise. As Evelyn Harrow watched her father's life slip away, his final breath carried not prayers but panic. The wheat, Evelyn. Don't let it die. Now she stood alone in fields that stretched like golden oceans, her bleeding hands wrapped around a scythe too heavy to swing, time running out with every passing sun. One woman, 60 acres. 3 weeks until frost killed it all. Then a stranger rode through her gate, and everything changed. Welcome to a story of impossible promises and unexpected grace. Stay until the end to see how 2 broken souls harvested more than wheat, and please comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The morning her father died, Evelyn Harrow learned that grief has a sound. It wasn't the soft weeping she'd heard at her mother's funeral 5 years prior, nor the dignified silence that had filled the church when they buried her brother after the war. No, this grief came with a wheeze, a rattle, a desperate clutching of her hand as Thomas Harrow fought for one more breath, one more moment, one more chance to say the things that mattered. But when that breath finally came, it wasn't, "I love you," or "You'll be fine," or even "Your mother's waiting for me in heaven." It was, "The wheat, Evelyn. Promise me, don't let the wheat die." She'd promised. God help her, she'd promised. Now 3 days after they'd lowered him into the Montana earth beside her mother and brother, Evelyn stood in the middle of 60 acres of unharvested wheat and understood exactly what an impossible promise looked like. The stalks rose around her like walls of gold, higher than her waist, whispering in the September wind with a sound like 1,000 voices murmuring secrets. They bent and swayed in waves that rolled toward the distant mountains, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Beautiful because the crop was good, the best her father had grown in years. Terrible because there was so damn much of it, and she was alone. Evelyn lifted the scythe again, feeling the wooden handle dig into the fresh blisters that had formed over yesterday's blisters. The blade was dull, despite her attempts to sharpen it last night by lantern light. She'd watched her father do it 100 times, the whetstone singing against steel in a rhythm he'd learned from his father. But watching and doing were 2 different things, and the blade still caught and tore rather than slicing clean. She positioned herself at the edge of the uncut section, a pitiful dent in the vast field, and swung. The blade caught halfway through the stalks. She yanked it free and swung again. Her shoulders screamed in protest. The muscles in her back, already knotted from 2 days of this hell, seized up so badly, she gasped. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Promise me, Evelyn. The sun climbed higher, turning the September morning from cool to warm to blazingly hot. Sweat ran down her face, stinging her eyes and plastering her dark hair to her forehead beneath the wide-brimmed hat that had been her father's. Her dress, already stained with dirt and chaff, clung to her back. The leather gloves she wore, also her father's, far too large, slipped with each swing, making her grip uncertain. By noon, she'd managed to cut perhaps 1/10 of an acre. At this rate, she'd finish the harvest sometime next spring. If she didn't die first, if the frost didn't come, if the wind didn't flatten the crop or the rain didn't rot it in the field. Evelyn let the scythe drop and pressed her palms against her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened. She wouldn't cry. Crying was weakness, and weakness meant failure, and failure meant breaking her promise to a dying man who'd given everything to hold on to this land. The Harrow farm sat in a valley where the Yellowstone River carved its way through the Montana Territory, in a place where the mountains met the prairie and the soil ran deep and black. Her grandfather had claimed the land in 1863, back when the territory was wild and full of promise. He'd built the small cabin that her father had later expanded into a proper house. He'd broken the prairie with a team of oxen and his own back, turning grass into fields that could feed a family. Then he'd died, as men did in this country, quickly and without much ceremony. A fall from a spooked horse, a broken neck, gone before sunset. Evelyn's father had been 17. Thomas Harrow had taken his father's dream and made it his own, adding acres when he could afford it, improving the house, building a barn that stood straight and proud against the wind. He'd married Evelyn's mother, Sarah, a school teacher from Pennsylvania who'd come west with more courage than sense. Together they'd had 3 children, Samuel, who died at Shiloh with a bullet in his chest, Margaret, who died at age 6 from scarlet fever, and Evelyn, who'd had the good fortune to be born strong and stubborn enough to survive everything Montana could throw at her. Until her mother had died in 71, and Samuel in 62, and Margaret before Evelyn could even remember her face. Until it was just Evelyn and her father, working the land together, surviving together. Until 3 days ago, when she'd become the last harrow standing. "I can't do this," she whispered to the wheat, to the wind, to the empty sky. "Papa, I can't." But the wheat didn't care. The wind didn't answer, and the sky stretched on forever, indifferent and blue. She picked up the scythe again. Fine. By evening, every muscle in her body felt like it had been beaten with a hammer. Her hands had gone numb hours ago, which was a mercy. At least she couldn't feel the blisters bursting anymore. She'd managed to clear perhaps a quarter acre, the cut wheat lying in rough, uneven piles that would need to be gathered into sheaves and stacked to dry. That was tomorrow's problem. Tonight's problem was simpler, putting one foot in front of the other long enough to reach the house. The farmhouse looked small and lonely in the fading light, its whitewashed boards going gray in the dusk. Smoke should have been rising from the chimney. Her father should have been on the porch, lighting his pipe, asking about her day in town or commenting on the weather. The barn doors should have been open, with him inside tending to the horses and the milk cow. Instead, there was silence, emptiness, the particular kind of absence that dead people leave behind. Evelyn climbed the porch steps, her legs shaking, and pushed open the door. The house smelled like her father, pipe tobacco and leather, and the peppermint candies he'd loved. His coat still hung by the door. His boots sat where he'd left them, caked with dried mud. The newspaper he'd been reading 3 nights ago lay folded on the table beside his chair. She couldn't bring herself to move any of it. In the kitchen, she found the last of yesterday's bread and the cold remains of the stew the neighbor woman, Mrs. Brennan, had brought after the funeral. Evelyn ate standing up, too tired to sit, too numb to taste. When she finished, she washed her plate in the basin and stared out the window at the darkening fields. 60 acres. Maybe 58 now, if she was generous about her progress. 3 weeks until the first hard frost, according to the almanac. Impossible. The words settled into her bones like a sickness. She lit a lantern and carried it to her father's room. Her room now, she supposed, though the thought felt wrong. The bed was still unmade from his last morning, the blankets tangled as if he'd fought with them. She straightened them carefully, smoothing the wrinkles, tucking the corners. Then she lay down on top of the covers, fully dressed, too exhausted to do more. Sleep came fast and black, dreamless and deep. The knock on the door came just after dawn. Evelyn woke with a start, her body screaming in protest as she tried to sit up. Every muscle had stiffened overnight. Her hands were swollen, the blisters angry and red. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was or why everything hurt. Then it all came flooding back. The knock sounded again, firmer this time. "Miss Harrow? Evelyn? You in there?" She recognized the voice, Martin Brennan, their nearest neighbor. He and his wife, Dorothy, had been kind after her father's death, bringing food and offering condolences. She knew what came next, an offer to buy the land. It's what happened to widows and orphans in this country. The land was too much. They couldn't manage. Better to sell, take the money, move to town, find easier lives. Evelyn pushed herself to her feet, biting back a groan, and made her way to the door. She opened it to find Martin Brennan on her porch, hat in hands, his weathered face arranged in an expression of practiced sympathy. "Morning, Evelyn," he said. "Hope I didn't wake you." "I was up," she lied. "Good, good." He shifted his weight, glancing past her into the house. "Listen, Dorothy sent me over with some eggs and bacon. Thought you might need a good breakfast." "That's kind of her." Evelyn took the basket he offered, noting the way his eyes flicked to her bandaged hands. "Those look painful." "They're fine. Been working the wheat, I see." "Yes." "By yourself?" It wasn't a question, but Evelyn answered anyway. "Yes." Martin Brennan was a good man, she knew. Honest, hardworking, a decent neighbor. But he was also a farmer, and farmers understood numbers. He understood what 60 acres of wheat meant for one woman alone. "Evelyn," he said gently, "you know that's not possible. I made a promise." I know you did. Thomas told me. Martin stepped closer, lowering his voice. But your father wouldn't want you to kill yourself trying to keep it. The land's too much for one person. Hell, it's too much for two during harvest. Thomas and I used to help each other. Then help me. The words came out sharper than she intended. You said you and Papa helped each other, so help me finish the harvest. Martin's expression shifted, sympathy giving way to discomfort. I got my own crop to bring in, Evelyn. I'm 2 weeks behind as it is. The weather's turning. If I don't get my wheat in soon... I understand. She did understand. Of course she did. Every farmer in the valley was racing against the same clock. Look, Martin said, I've been thinking. My cousin in Billings is looking to expand his holdings. He'd give you a fair price for the land, more than fair considering. You could move to town, maybe open a shop or find work with one of the merchants. There's no shame in it, Evelyn. This country's hard on men. It's twice as hard on women alone. I'm not selling. Be reasonable. I said no. Evelyn straightened, meeting his eyes. Thank you for the food, Mr. Brennan. Please thank Dorothy for her kindness. But the land isn't for sale. She could see him wrestling with whether to push further. In the end, he simply nodded, placed his hat back on his head, and took a step back. You change your mind. You know where to find me, he said. I won't change my mind. He left then, climbing onto his horse and riding back toward his own farm without looking back. Evelyn stood on the porch until he disappeared, then carried the basket inside and sat down at the kitchen table. Her hands throbbed, her back ached, her shoulders felt like someone had set them on fire. She ate the eggs and bacon anyway. She'd need the strength. Plus, by mid-morning, she was back in the field, the scythe familiar now in her ruined hands. She'd wrapped them in fresh bandages torn from an old sheet, then pulled the 2 large gloves over them. It helped, a little. The sun beat down from a cloudless sky. The wheat whispered and bent. The mountains watched, distant and indifferent. Swing, cut, step, swing, come, cut, step. A rhythm emerged, mindless and mechanical. If she didn't think about the acres ahead, didn't think about the impossible task, didn't think about anything except the next swing of the blade, she could keep going, swing, cut, step. Her mind drifted, untethered. She thought about her father, about the way he'd loved this land with a fierceness that bordered on obsession. The land provides, he used to say. You take care of it, and it takes care of you. She'd believed him once. Now she wasn't so sure. The land had taken her grandfather, her brother, her mother, her father. What had it given back except hard work and heartbreak? But it had also given her wheat. Good wheat. Acres of it, waiting to be harvested and sold. Worth enough to pay off the bank loan her father had taken out for seed and equipment. Worth enough to keep the farm for another year. If she could bring it in. If. Swing, cut, step. The sun climbed higher. Noon came and went. She didn't stop to eat, didn't stop to rest. If she stopped, she might not start again. By late afternoon, she'd cleared another 1/4 acre. Progress, but not enough. Never enough. That's when she heard the horse. Evelyn straightened, one hand pressed to the small of her back, and shaded her eyes against the sun. A rider approached from the east, following the wagon road that led to the main trail. Not Martin Brennan. This horse was different, a rangy buckskin that moved with an easy, ground-covering stride. She watched as the rider drew closer, resolving from a distant speck into a man on horseback. He sat his saddle with the loose, comfortable posture of someone who'd spent more time mounted than on foot. As he neared the edge of her property, he slowed, then stopped, sitting quiet for a moment, as if waiting for permission to approach further. Evelyn didn't move. Strangers were rare out here, and rarely good news. The man nudged his horse forward, walking now, until he reached the fence line that bordered the field. He was lean and weathered, maybe 35 or 40, with sun-darkened skin and light brown hair that needed cutting. He wore the practical clothes of a working man, canvas pants, a faded shirt, a leather vest. A bedroll and saddlebags were tied behind his saddle. A drifter, then. Looking for work, probably. "Afternoon, ma'am," he called out. His voice was low and even, neither aggressive nor uncertain. "Fine day for harvest." Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She studied him, noting the way he sat slightly crooked in the saddle, favoring his left side. An injury, old enough to have healed, but recent enough to still cause trouble. "Can I help you?" she asked finally. "Actually, ma'am, I was hoping I could help you." He gestured at the fields. "Looks like you got a lot of wheat to bring in." "That's my concern, not yours." "Fair enough." He didn't take offense, just nodded. "Name's James Carter. I'm heading west, looking for work along the way. Good with horses, decent with a scythe, honest labor for fair wages." "I can't pay wages." "What can you pay?" Evelyn hesitated. Something about the man's calm demeanor, the lack of pressure in his voice, made her want to trust him. But trust was expensive, and she'd seen what happened to women who trusted the wrong men. "Nothing," she said flatly. "I can't pay you anything." Most men would have ridden on at that. James Carter just sat his horse and looked at the wheat, then back at her, then at the wheat again. "You doing this all by yourself?" he asked. "Yes." "How much you got left to cut?" "Nearly 60 acres. He whistled low. "And how much time before frost?" 3 weeks. Maybe less." James Carter was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. Then he seemed to come to a decision. He swung down from his horse with a grunt, favoring that left leg, and tied the reins to the fence post. "What are you doing?" Evelyn asked. "Helping." "I told you I can't pay." "Then I'll take Faith as payment," he said simply. He reached for the saddlebags and pulled out a worn pair of work gloves. "You got a spare scythe?" Evelyn stared at him. "You don't even know me." "No, ma'am, I don't. But I know what it looks like when someone's drowning in work they can't do alone." He met her eyes, and she saw something there. Not pity, thank God, but something quieter. Understanding, maybe. "Where I come from, you help folks who need helping, no charge required." "Where are you from?" "Texas originally, but I've been a lot of places since." "Why?" "Why what?" "Why are you really doing this?" James Carter pulled on his gloves slowly, taking his time with the answer. "I suppose," he said finally, "because someone helped me once when I needed it. Seemed right to pass it along." It was the simplest, most honest thing anyone had said to her in days. Evelyn felt something crack inside her chest, some tight, fearful thing she hadn't known she was holding. "There's a second scythe in the barn," she heard herself say, "and a spare cradle if you know how to use one." "I do." "You can sleep in the barn loft. There's straw up there, and blankets. I'll feed you what I can." "That's more than fair, ma'am." "My name is Evelyn. Evelyn Harrow." "Miss Harrow, then." He touched 2 fingers to his hat brim in a gesture that was somehow both respectful and friendly. "Lead the way to that barn." James Carter knew his way around a cradle scythe, the way some men knew their way around a gun or a rope, with the kind of competence that came from years of practice. The cradle was a long-handled scythe with wooden fingers attached above the blade, designed to catch the cut stalks and lay them in even rows. It was faster than a regular scythe, but required more skill and strength. He worked through the afternoon without speaking much, falling into a rhythm beside her. Where her cutting was rough and uneven, his was smooth and practiced. The wheat fell in neat swaths, ready to be gathered. For every row she managed, he finished 3. Evelyn told herself not to be ashamed of the difference. He was bigger, stronger, and clearly experienced. She was doing her best, but God, it was hard to watch someone do easily what had nearly broken her. They worked until the sun began to set, turning the wheat fields gold and amber and bronze. The air cooled. Shadows stretched long across the stubble. "We should stop," Evelyn said finally, her voice rough from disuse and dust. "Can't see well enough to cut clean in the dark." James straightened, rolling his shoulders. She saw him wince and press a hand to his left side, just above his hip. "You hurt?" she asked. "Old injury, acts up sometimes." He smiled, but there was a tightness around his eyes. "Nothing that won't mend with rest." They walked back to the house together, not speaking. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the shared quiet of 2 people too tired for conversation. Evelyn left him at the barn with a lantern and a promise of supper in an hour. Inside, she heated water and washed the day's dirt and chaff from her face and hands. Her hands were worse than yesterday, the blisters opened and raw. She wrapped them carefully, then set about making supper from what she had, cornbread and beans, with a bit of salt pork for flavor. When it was ready, she stood on the porch and called toward the barn, "Mr. Carter, supper!" He emerged a few minutes later, his face and hands clean, his hair damp. She'd set 2 places at the kitchen table, and he hesitated in the doorway. "You sure you want me in the house?" he asked. "I'm fine eating in the barn." "Sit down before the food gets cold." He sat. They ate without talking, both too hungry and tired for small talk. The cornbread was dry and the beans were bland, but neither complained. When they finished, James helped clear the dishes without being asked. "That was good, Miss Harrow, thank you." "It was terrible, but you're welcome." He smiled, a real smile this time, reaching his eyes. "I've had worse." "On the trail?" "Among other places." Evelyn wanted to ask more. Where he'd been, what he'd done, why a man who clearly knew how to work was drifting alone through Montana territory. But exhaustion pulled at her like weights, and the questions could wait. "There's coffee if you want it," she said instead. "Otherwise, help yourself to anything you need from the barn." "I'm fine, ma'am. I'll see you at dawn." He left, and Evelyn stood in the kitchen listening to his footsteps cross the yard and the barn door creak open and shut. Then she was alone again, but somehow the house felt less empty than it had that morning. She collapsed into bed without bothering to change clothes and slept like the dead. The next day they fell into a pattern. Up at dawn. Quick breakfast of whatever she could put together, usually coffee and bread or porridge. Then into the fields, where they worked until midday heat forced a break. They'd eat bread and cheese in the shade of the single tree at the field's edge, then work until evening. James was a man of few words, but what he said mattered. He taught her to sharpen the scythe properly, to angle the blade, to let the tool do the work instead of muscling through. He showed her how to tie sheaves that wouldn't come undone, how to stack them so air could circulate and prevent rot. "Who taught you all this?" she asked on the 3rd day. "My father, mostly, and a German farmer I worked for in Kansas. He could cut wheat faster than any 3 men. James paused in his work. "You learn quick, Miss Harrow, quicker than most." "I don't have a choice." "We always got choices. You're choosing not to give up." "My father, I know about promises to dying fathers," James said quietly. "I know how heavy they weigh." She wanted to ask what promise he'd made, but something in his expression stopped her. Some old pain that wasn't hers to poke at. By the end of the week, they'd cleared nearly 15 acres, more than Evelyn would have managed alone in a month. The cut wheat lay in long rows of sheaves, drying in the September sun. The work was still brutal, still endless, but it was no longer impossible. She no longer felt like she was drowning. On Sunday, Evelyn insisted they rest. "Even God rested on the 7th day," she said. James smiled. "Don't recall God having wheat to bring in, but I won't argue." She made a better breakfast than usual. Eggs from the chickens, bacon from the smokehouse, fresh bread she'd baked the night before. They ate on the porch, watching the sunrise over the mountains. "You got family out in California?" Evelyn asked. It was the first truly personal question she'd dared. "No, ma'am." "Texas?" "Not anymore." "Then why go west?" James was quiet for a long moment. Sometimes a man needs to leave the past behind, go somewhere new, be someone different. "Running from something?" "Maybe, or running towards something. Haven't decided which yet." Evelyn understood that. She'd felt the same way after her mother died, after Samuel died, after each loss carved another piece from her heart. The urge to leave, to go somewhere that didn't have so many ghosts. But her father had needed her, the land had needed her, now she needed to stay for herself. "The past has a way of following you," she said softly. "Does it?" "In my experience." James looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw recognition in his eyes. Whatever ghosts he carried, he knew she had her own. "Then I guess," he said, "we'd best make peace with what follows us." The second week brought challenges neither of them expected. On Monday, one of the workhorses, old Ben, her father's favorite, came up lame. James examined the hoof and found a stone bruise, nothing serious, but enough to keep the animal from work for several days. "We'll work slower," he said. "It's not ideal, but we'll manage." On Wednesday, a band of crow riders passed through, heading north toward their reservation. James stepped forward to meet them while Evelyn stayed back. her father's rifle held loosely in her hands. But the riders were peaceful, just asking about the distance to the next water. James spoke to them in halting Crow, enough to make them smile and nod. They left gifts, a string of dried meat and a doeskin bag of ground corn. "You speak Crow?" Evelyn asked after they'd gone. "Enough to be polite. Learned it in Wyoming." "You've been around." "More than I wanted to be." On Friday, the wind came. It started as a whisper in the morning, a restless stirring of air that made the wheat dance. By noon it was gusting hard enough to snatch Evelyn's hat from her head and send it tumbling across the field. By evening it was howling, a genuine Montana wind that tore at anything not tied down and threatened to flatten the uncut wheat. They worked frantically to secure what they'd already harvested, piling stones on the tarps covering the sheaves, tying down everything that could blow away. The dust was blinding, getting into their eyes and mouths and noses. "This keeps up, it'll lodge the standing wheat," James shouted over the wind. Lodging, when the stalks bent so far they couldn't recover, was a farmer's nightmare. Lodged wheat was nearly impossible to cut clean. "I know!" Evelyn shouted back. There was nothing they could do but pray. That night, as the wind screamed around the house, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she was too anxious to drink. She'd invited James inside. It seemed cruel to make him stay in the barn with the building rattling like it might fly apart. He sat across from her, his hands wrapped around his own cup, his face drawn with worry that matched her own. "It'll pass," he said. "Wind always does. Not before it does damage. Maybe, but worrying won't change it." "That's easy to say." James smiled faintly. Never said it was easy. Just said it was true. They sat in silence, listening to the wind rage. At some point, without deciding to, Evelyn started talking. She told him about her father, about the kind of man he'd been, stubborn and proud, and so damn determined to keep the land. She told him about her mother, about Samuel, about being the last one left. She told him things she'd never said aloud, things that had lived in the quiet corners of her heart for years. And James listened, didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes, just listened with the kind of attention that made her feel heard. When she finally ran out of words, he spoke. "My father had a farm in Texas," he said. "Small place, but good land. He worked it alone after my mother died, and I was going to take it over when he got too old." James stared into his cup. "But I went to war instead. Came back and found he'd sold it, couldn't keep it up without help. He died before I could tell him I was sorry for leaving." "What did you do?" "Drifted. Figured I didn't deserve roots after I'd abandoned his. Worked cattle drives, mines, lumber camps. Stayed nowhere long enough to matter." "Until now?" James met her eyes. "I don't know about that, Miss Harrow. This is just another stop on the road." But the way he said it, uncertain, almost questioning, made Evelyn wonder if he was trying to convince himself. The wind blew all night. In the morning, they surveyed the damage. Half the uncut wheat was lodged, bent nearly flat by the relentless wind. It could still be harvested, but it would take twice as long and yield less. Evelyn stood in the field and wanted to scream, wanted to rage at the sky, at the wind, at the unfairness of it all. Instead, she picked up her scythe. "Let's get to work," she said. Chip. They cut the lodged wheat on their knees, pulling it up by hand when the scythe wouldn't catch it properly. It was back-breaking, soul-crushing work that left them both filthy and exhausted. But they did it. Hour after hour, day after day, they did it. James's leg got worse. Evelyn could see him struggling, see the pain he tried to hide. On Tuesday of the third week, he finally collapsed, just dropped in the middle of a row, his face gray. "Mr. Carter!" Evelyn ran to him, fear spiking through her chest. "James!" "I'm fine," he gasped. "Just need a minute." "You're not fine. Let me see." "Leave it. Let me see." She pulled his vest aside and lifted his shirt and nearly gasped. An old wound, a scar that ran from his left hip to his ribs, was swollen and angry-looking. It wasn't infected, thank God, but he'd clearly been pushing himself too hard. "Why didn't you say something?" she demanded. "We got work to do. Not if you kill yourself doing it." James tried to smile. "Would be ashamed to die before seeing that wheat sold." "This isn't funny." "No, ma'am, it's not." She helped him to the house, half carrying him when his leg wouldn't hold, got him onto her father's bed, stopped thinking of it as his bed, and fetched water and cloths. She cleaned the old wound, applied the salve her mother had taught her to make from herbs and lard, and wrapped his ribs tight. "You rest," she ordered. "I'll handle the field." "Evelyn, don't argue with me." He searched her face, and whatever he saw there made him nod. "Yes, ma'am." She left him there and went back to the wheat alone. That night, after she'd worked until her body was shaking with exhaustion, she found him in the barn. He'd dragged himself out there despite her orders, had been repairing a broken harness by lantern light. "You're supposed to be resting," she said. "I'm not good at resting." "I noticed." James set down the harness. "Evelyn, I'm sorry. I should have told you about the injury. You should have trusted me to help you the way you've been helping me." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm not used to accepting help." "Neither am I. Seems we're both learning." She sat down on the workbench beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. They sat in comfortable silence, the lantern casting shadows that danced on the barn walls. "We're going to make it," James said finally. "The harvest. We're going to make it." "You sure?" "I am." "How can you be?" He turned to look at her, and in the lantern light his eyes were warm. "Because I've seen what you're made of, Evelyn Harrow, and you don't quit. No matter how hard it gets, you don't quit." Something shifted between them in that moment. Some invisible line that they'd been careful not to cross suddenly disappeared. Evelyn felt it in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat and everything to do with the man beside her. "Thank you," she whispered, "for staying, for helping, for—" She didn't finish because she didn't know how to finish. "For making me feel less alone, for reminding me that good people still exist, for looking at me like I'm not just a woman to be pitied or saved, but someone worth knowing." James understood anyway. "You're welcome." They sat until the lantern burned low, neither wanting to move, neither ready to break the spell of the moment. Finally, Evelyn stood. "Get some sleep, Mr. Carter. We've got another long day tomorrow." "Yes, ma'am. You too." She left him there and walked back to the house, her heart full of something she couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe. Or something more dangerous. The final week of September arrived with cooler mornings and the first hints of frost on the distant peaks. James's injury healed enough for him to work again, though Evelyn made him promise to tell her if it got bad. They pushed harder, knowing time was running out. The neighbors began to notice. Martin Brennan rode by one afternoon and found them working together in the field. He didn't say anything, just nodded and kept riding, but Evelyn saw the speculation in his eyes. Let them speculate. She didn't care. By Wednesday, they'd cut and stacked 40 acres. By Friday, 45. The wheat dried in neat stooks that dotted the field like small monuments to their labor. "We're going to do it," Evelyn said on Saturday evening, staring at the shrinking expanse of uncut field. "We're actually going to do it." "Never doubted it," James said, though his smile suggested he absolutely had. That night, as they ate supper, roasted chicken from one of her hens, the first real meal she'd had energy to cook in weeks, Evelyn asked the question she'd been avoiding. "What will you do after the harvest is finished?" James's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "I suppose I'll move on, like I planned." "To California? Or somewhere else? Haven't decided." "You could stay." The words were out before she could stop them, naked and vulnerable in the lamplight between them. James set down his fork carefully. "Evelyn, I know you're a drifter. I know you don't put down roots. I know this was always temporary." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "But I'm asking anyway. Stay. Help me run the farm. It's too much for one person. You said so yourself." "What are you offering?" "Partnership. Half the profits, half the decisions, half the work." "That's generous." "It's fair." James looked at her for a long moment. "What else are you offering?" Evelyn's breath caught. "What do you want?" "I think you know." And she did. She'd known for days, maybe weeks. Known it in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, in the way his hand lingered when he passed her tools, in the way he always seemed to be within reach when she needed him. She'd known because she felt the same. "I'm offering whatever you'll take," she said quietly. James stood and walked around the table. He stopped in front of her chair, and when she stood to face him, he was close enough that she could feel the heat of him. I gave up on roots years ago, he said. Told myself I didn't deserve them, that I'd just destroy them like I destroyed everything else good in my life. James, but maybe I found them here. Maybe I found something worth staying for. He reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers gentle against her cheek. If you'll have me, I'll have you. He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. And Evelyn kissed him back, tasting dust and hope and the future all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. One condition, he said. What? We finish the harvest first, no distractions. Evelyn laughed, the first real laugh she'd had in weeks. Deal, what? The last of the wheat fell on the 28th of September, just as the first real frost threatened. They worked through the night by lantern light, refusing to stop, refusing to let the weather win. When the final stalk was cut, when the last sheaf was tied and stacked, Evelyn stood in the middle of the empty field and felt something break inside her, the tight, terrible knot of fear and responsibility that had been choking her for weeks. She'd done it. They'd done it. James came up beside her, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, and took her hand. It's done, he said simply. It's done, she echoed. They stood there as the sun rose, painting the stubble field in shades of gold and amber. The wheat stacks stood like monuments to their labor, ready to be threshed and sold. The farm was saved, the promise was kept, and Evelyn Harrow, for the first time since her father died, felt something other than grief and fear. She felt whole. The threshing took another week of brutal work, but it felt different now. The desperate race against time had ended, replaced by the steady, methodical rhythm of separating grain from chaff. James rigged up the old thresher her father had bought 3 years back, oiling the gears and replacing a broken belt with one he fashioned from strips of leather. Together they fed the sheaves through, collecting the golden kernels in burlap sacks that grew heavy with promise. Evelyn found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, the way his shoulders moved under his shirt, the concentration on his face as he adjusted the machine, the small smile that touched his lips when he caught her staring. Each glance felt like a secret they were keeping from the world, even though there was no one around for miles to see. On the third day of threshing, Dorothy Brennan arrived unannounced with a basket of preserves and what Evelyn recognized immediately as an excuse to satisfy her curiosity. The older woman's eyes went wide when she saw James working the thresher, then narrowed thoughtfully as she took in the scene. Two people working in easy harmony, the kind that only came from weeks of shared labor. "Evelyn, dear," Dorothy said, her voice carefully neutral, "I didn't know you'd hired help." "Mr. Carter has been assisting with the harvest," Evelyn replied, keeping her tone just as neutral. "I couldn't have managed without him." "I see." Dorothy's gaze flicked between them. "And where exactly did you find Mr. Carter?" "He found me, Mrs. Brennan." James had stopped working and come over, wiping his hands on a rag. "Rode through looking for work. Miss Harrow was kind enough to offer me room and board." "How fortunate." Dorothy's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Martin mentioned he'd offered to help connect you with potential buyers, Evelyn. For the farm. I won't be selling." "Ah, I see." The older woman's expression suggested she saw quite a bit more than Evelyn was comfortable with. "Well, if you need anything, advice, assistance with the sale of the wheat, anything at all, you know where to find us." After Dorothy left, Evelyn let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "That'll be all over the valley by tomorrow." "What will?" James asked, though his slight smile suggested he knew exactly what. "That I've got a man staying on my property, unmarried woman, unknown drifter. You know how people talk." "Does it bother you, the talk?" Evelyn considered that. A month ago, she would have said yes. A month ago, she'd cared desperately about maintaining respectability, about what the neighbors thought, about doing everything exactly right so no one could say the Harrow girl had brought shame to her father's memory. Now? Now she'd spent 3 weeks working shoulder to shoulder with a man who'd stayed when he had every reason to leave, who'd asked nothing in return, who'd proven himself in every way that mattered. No, she said finally. Let them talk. James's smile widened into something warm and real. Good, because I'm not going anywhere. That night, after they'd filled another dozen sacks with threshed wheat, James suggested they take a walk. The evening was cool and clear, the kind of September night that hinted at the winter to come. They walked without destination, following the creek that marked the eastern boundary of her property. My father used to bring me here when I was little, Evelyn said, watching the water catch the last light of day. Said this creek never ran dry, even in the worst droughts. He took it as a sign that the land would always provide. Smart man. Stubborn man. There's a difference. Is there? James smiled. Seems to me stubbornness kept this farm alive. My stubbornness or his? Both. They sat on a flat rock near the water's edge, close enough that their shoulders touched. Evelyn found herself leaning into that warmth, into the solid presence of him beside her. Tell me about Texas, she said. Your father's farm. James was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, it was small, maybe 30 acres, mostly cotton, with some corn. Had a house my grandfather built, real wood, not sod. My mother kept a garden that was the envy of the county. His voice went soft with memory. She died when I was 12, fever. After that, it was just me and my father. Like me and mine. Yeah, like you and yours. What was he like? Your father? Quiet, stern, loved that land more than he loved just about anything. James picked up a pebble and tossed it into the creek. When the war came, I enlisted. Thought I was doing something noble, something important. Left him alone to work the farm. You couldn't have known. I knew he needed me. I went anyway. The bitterness in his voice was old and deep. 4 years I was gone. 4 years of fighting and dying and watching boys I'd grown up with get torn apart by cannon fire. And when I finally came home, the farm was sold. He tried to keep it going, but he was too old, too tired. Couldn't do it alone. Evelyn reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. What happened to him? Lived another 6 months in a boarding house in town. Just gave up. Didn't have anything left to live for once the land was gone. James's grip tightened on hers. I was there when he died. He looked at me and said, "At least you're home." Like that made up for everything. Like my being there at the end somehow fixed the fact that I'd abandoned him when he needed me most. James, I swore after that I'd never put down roots again. Never give myself the chance to fail someone else the way I failed him. He turned to look at her, his eyes dark with old pain. And then I rode onto your farm and saw you trying to bring in 60 acres alone, and I thought, here's someone who needs help. Someone who's stubborn enough to kill herself trying. And maybe, just maybe, I could do this one thing right. Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes. You did. You did do it right. Did I? Or did I just find another place to run to? You stayed, James. When anyone else would have ridden on, you stayed. That's not running. He studied her face in the fading light, and whatever he saw there seemed to ease something in him. No, I suppose it's not. They sat by the creek until the stars came out, talking about nothing and everything, the little things that made up a life, the dreams they'd had as children, the people they'd lost. And when they finally walked back to the house, hand in hand in the darkness, Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt like she was home. The wheat sold for more than she'd dared hope. Mr. Patterson, the grain broker who came up from Billings, examined the wheat and nodded approvingly at its quality. Your father always grew good wheat, Miss Harrow. Looks like you've carried on the tradition. Mr. Carter deserves the credit, Evelyn said. Without his help, there wouldn't have been a harvest. Patterson glanced at James, who stood quietly nearby. You looking for permanent work, Carter? I know several farms that could use a man who knows wheat. I'm employed, thank you. Ah, Patterson's eyebrows rose slightly. Well then, Miss Harrow, shall we discuss terms? They settled on a price that would pay off her father's debts, cover the winter expenses, and leave enough to buy seed for next year's crop. When Patterson left with a promise to send wagons for the grain within the week, Evelyn stood in the yard holding the promissory note and felt the weight of months of fear finally lift from her shoulders. We did it. she whispered. We really did it. James came up behind her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. You did it. I just helped. Don't. She turned to face him. Don't diminish what you've done. This farm would be gone without you. I would be gone without you. Evelyn, I mean it. You saved more than the wheat, James Carter. You saved me. He pulled her close then, right there in the yard where anyone passing by could see, and kissed her like she was something precious. And Evelyn kissed him back, pouring everything she felt into it. Gratitude and affection and something deeper, something that felt like the beginning of love. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. So what now? Now we start planning for next year, figure out what crops to plant, what needs repairing before winter, how to make this place profitable. She smiled. Together, as partners. Is that all we are? Partners? For now. She stepped back, though it cost her. Let's do this properly, James. Court me like a gentleman. Give the neighbors something to talk about besides scandal. You sure? Because I've got no problem with scandal. Evelyn laughed. I'm sure. Besides, if you're staying, we've got all the time in the world. The following Sunday, they rode into town together for church. It was Evelyn's first appearance in public since her father's funeral, and she felt every eye in the building follow them as they walked down the aisle. James, dressed in his only good shirt and a borrowed jacket, kept his hand respectfully on her elbow, projecting nothing but propriety. But Evelyn saw the looks, heard the whispers, knew exactly what everyone was thinking. She didn't care. After the service, Martin Brennan approached them on the church steps. Miss Harrow, Carter. He nodded to each in turn. Heard the wheat sold well. It did. Thank you for asking. That's good. Real good. Martin shifted his weight, clearly working up to something. Look, Evelyn, I may have been hasty in my offer before. If you're determined to keep the farm, and it looks like you've got help now, well, Dorothy and I would be happy to assist however we can. Neighborly cooperation and all that. It was as close to an apology as she was going to get. I appreciate that, Mr. Brennan. Truly. Of course, there's still the matter of... Martin glanced at James, then back to Evelyn. Folks are wondering about your plans, your intentions. James stiffened beside her, but Evelyn squeezed his arm gently. Our intentions are to run a successful farm and be good neighbors. I hope that's sufficient. And Carter here, he's staying on permanent? If he chooses to. I choose to, James said quietly. Miss Harrow has offered me a partnership in the farm. I've accepted. That caused a ripple of murmurs among the people within earshot. Martin's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. A partnership. I see. That's quite generous of you, Evelyn. It's fair compensation for the work Mr. Carter has done and will continue to do. Of course, of course. Martin looked like he wanted to say more, but Dorothy appeared at his elbow and gave him a quelling look. Well, congratulations to you both. I'm sure you'll make a fine success of it. As they walked away, James leaned down to murmur in her ear. That went better than expected. Give it time. The real gossip hasn't started yet. She was right. By the following week, when they went into town for supplies, the stares and whispers had intensified. Mrs. Henderson at the general store managed to be both obsequiously polite and deeply disapproving. The banker, Mr. Yatta. Wilkins took James aside to ask, in what he clearly thought was a subtle manner, about his intentions toward Miss Harrow. My intentions, James said with icy politeness, are to be the best partner she could ask for, in business and in life, if she'll have me. That set off another round of speculation. Evelyn heard about it third hand from Dorothy Brennan, who seemed to have appointed herself as some sort of intermediary between Evelyn and proper society. People are concerned, dear, Dorothy said over tea one afternoon. She'd taken to visiting once a week, ostensibly to check on Evelyn's well-being, but really, Evelyn suspected, to gather information. A young woman living with an unmarried man, no matter how proper the arrangement. Mrs. Brennan, I appreciate your concern, but James sleeps in the barn, I sleep in the house, and anyone who wants to believe otherwise can go to hell. Dorothy's teacup rattled in its saucer. Evelyn, I'm sorry, but I'm tired of apologizing for doing what I had to do to survive. James Carter is a good man, an honorable man. And if people can't see that, that's their failing, not ours. To her credit, Dorothy didn't leave in a huff. Instead, she set down her tea and looked at Evelyn with something like sympathy. You care for him. It wasn't a question. I do. Does he care for you? You'd have to ask him. I'm asking you what you believe. Evelyn met the older woman's eyes. I believe he does. I believe he stayed when he could have left. I believe he worked himself nearly to death to help me save my father's farm. I believe he looks at me like I'm worth something, and yes, I believe he cares. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and patted Evelyn's hand. Then the rest doesn't matter, does it? The gossip will die down eventually. It always does. Thank you. But Evelyn, Dorothy's expression turned serious. If you're going to do this, if you're going to build a life with this man, do it properly. Court publicly, marry respectably. Give people nothing to criticize. Is that advice or a threat? It's the wisdom of someone who's lived in this valley for 30 years. Dorothy squeezed her hand. I like you, dear. I liked your father. I'd hate to see you lose everything because of appearances. October arrived with cold mornings and shorter days. The farm settled into the quieter rhythm of autumn, repairing equipment, preparing for winter, planning for the next season. James proved to be as capable with a hammer and saw as he was with a scythe, fixing the barn roof and rebuilding the chicken coop with the same steady competence he brought to everything else. They fell into an easy domesticity that felt both natural and slightly surreal. Evelyn cooked while James tended the animals. They ate dinner together every night, talking about the day's work and the plans for tomorrow. Afterward, James would retreat to the barn while Evelyn cleaned up, and they'd meet again in the morning to start the cycle over. It was proper, respectable, completely maddening. How long are we going to keep this up? James asked one evening as they stood on the porch watching the sun set. He'd taken to joining her there before he went to the barn, stretching out these last moments of the day. Keep what up? Pretending we're just business partners. Evelyn's heart kicked in her chest. We are business partners. That's not all we are. No, she admitted, it's not. James turned to face her fully, his expression serious. I'm not good at games, Evelyn. Not good at dancing around what I want. So I'm going to say this plain. I want to court you, properly, publicly, with the intention of marriage, if you'll have me. James, I know I'm not much. A drifter with a bad leg and a past I'm not proud of. I can't offer you wealth or status or any of the things a woman like you deserves. But I can offer you honesty and hard work and a partnership built on respect. He took her hands in his, calloused palm against calloused palm. And I can offer you my heart, if you want it. Evelyn felt tears burn behind her eyes. You really don't see it, do you? See what? That you're everything I need. That you've already proven yourself in every way that matters. She stepped closer until they were nearly touching. Yes, James Carter. Yes, I'll let you court me. Yes, I want your heart, because you already have mine. He kissed her then, slow and deep and full of promise. And Evelyn let herself sink into it, let herself feel all the things she'd been holding back, desire and hope, and the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of a future. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James smiled against her lips. So when can I tell people you're my girl? Tell whoever you want. Even the church ladies? Especially the church ladies. They started courting in earnest after that. On Sundays, they rode into town together and sat side by side in church, their hands almost but not quite touching. James took her to dinner at the hotel dining room, spending money he couldn't really afford on a meal that wasn't as good as her cooking, but came with the stamp of respectability. They went on chaperoned walks with Dorothy Brennan trailing behind at a discreet distance, her presence ensuring that no one could accuse them of impropriety. It was absurd and formal, and nothing like what Evelyn wanted, which was simply to be alone with him, to talk without an audience, to touch him without worrying about who might see. But it was also necessary, she knew. The valley was watching, judging, waiting to see if the Harrow girl would do the right thing or if she'd shame her father's memory by living in sin with a drifter. So they played the game, and slowly, grudgingly, the community began to accept them. Martin Brennan invited them both to Sunday dinner, where he and James talked crops and weather and horses with the easy camaraderie of men who understood farm life. The banker approved a small loan for spring seed, noting that a partnership between Miss Harrow and Mr. Carter showed good business sense. Even Mrs. Henderson at the general store began to smile at them, though her eyes still held a glimmer of speculation. Through it all, James remained steady, patient, content to court her at society's pace, even though she could see the wanting in his eyes every time he looked at her. "You're torturing yourself," Evelyn said one evening as they sat on the porch, careful to maintain a respectable distance between them. "Worth it. Is it? To build a life with you, to do this right, so you never have to be ashamed or hide or apologize." James looked at her steadily. "Yeah, it's worth it. I'm not ashamed. I know, but I want to make sure no one else can make you feel that way." It was that kindness, that consideration, that made her fall completely, irrevocably in love with him. Late October brought the first snow, just a dusting that melted by midday, but served as a reminder that winter was coming. They spent a week laying in supplies, flour and sugar and coffee, salt pork and dried beans, everything they'd need to weather the months ahead. The root cellar was full of potatoes and carrots and turnips from the garden. The smokehouse held 2 butchered hogs. They were as ready as they could be. On the last Sunday in October, after church, James asked to speak with Reverend Matthews privately. Evelyn waited on the church steps, her heart pounding, knowing what he was asking for but not daring to hope. When he emerged 20 minutes later, he was smiling. "What did he say?" she asked as soon as they were in the wagon. "He said we've courted long enough to satisfy propriety. Said he'd be happy to marry us whenever we're ready." Evelyn's breath caught. "And when are we ready?" James took her hand, no longer caring who saw. "I've been ready since the day I rode onto your farm. The question is, when are you ready?" She didn't hesitate. "Tomorrow." He laughed, the sound bright and happy. "Tomorrow's Monday." "Then the day after that, or the day after that." "James, I don't want to wait anymore. I don't want to sleep in separate buildings and pretend we're just partners and dance around what we both know. I want to marry you as soon as possible." "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." They were married the following Saturday in a small ceremony at the church, with Martin and Dorothy Brennan serving as witnesses. Evelyn wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and only slightly yellowed with age. James wore a new suit he'd bought in town, looking uncomfortable and handsome in equal measure. Reverend Matthews kept the ceremony short and simple. When he pronounced them man and wife, James kissed her with a reverence that made Evelyn's knees weak. Afterward, the Brennans hosted a small celebration at their home, cake and coffee and well wishes from the handful of neighbors who'd been invited. Everyone was carefully, determinedly cheerful, as if by sheer force of will they could make this marriage respectable. Evelyn didn't care. She was married to James Carter, and nothing else mattered. They left the Brennans' house as the sun was setting, riding back to the farm in the wagon. Their farm now, their home. "Nervous?" James asked as they pulled into the yard. "Should I be?" "I don't know. Are you?" Evelyn considered that. A month ago, the thought of sharing her life, her home, her bed with a man would have terrified her. Now it felt right, inevitable, like everything had been leading to this moment. "No," she said softly. "I'm not nervous." James helped her down from the wagon, his hand strong and steady on her waist. Instead of setting her down, he lifted her completely, carrying her toward the house. "What are you doing?" she laughed. "Carrying my wife over the threshold. It's tradition." Where did a Texas cowboy learn about wedding traditions? "I contain multitudes, Mrs. Carter." Mrs. Carter. The name sent a thrill through her. James carried her through the door and into the house that was finally, fully theirs. And when he set her down and pulled her close, Evelyn went willingly, eagerly, ready to begin this new chapter of their lives. The harvest was over. The wheat was sold. Winter was coming. But inside the farmhouse, 2 people who'd found each other against all odds were just beginning to grow. Winter came to the Montana Territory the way it always did, sudden and unforgiving, transforming the golden prairie into a white expanse that stretched endlessly in every direction. The first real storm hit in mid-November, 3 weeks after their wedding. dumping 2 feet of snow overnight and trapping them inside the farmhouse for 3 days straight. Evelyn found she didn't mind at all. They spent those days learning the rhythms of married life, the small intimacies of sharing space, the quiet comfort of companionship, the way two people could exist together without words and still feel perfectly understood. James proved to be surprisingly domestic, insisting on helping with cooking and cleaning despite her protests that she could manage. "We're partners, remember?" he said, elbow deep in dishwater on the second day of their confinement. "That means everything gets shared, the work, the decisions, all of it." "My father would have never touched a dish," Evelyn said, watching him with bemused affection. "Your father had a wife and daughter to do it for him. I just have you, and I'll be damned if I'm going to sit idle while you work yourself ragged." "Such language, Mr. Carter." "Mrs. Carter, you haven't heard the half of my vocabulary." She laughed and swatted him with the dish towel, and he caught her wrist and pulled her close, soap suds and all. These moments, playful and tender and utterly ordinary, felt more precious than anything she'd ever known. After months of grief and fear and bone-deep exhaustion, she'd found something she hadn't even known she was searching for: joy. When the storm finally broke, they ventured out to check on the animals. The barn had held strong against the wind, and the livestock were cold but healthy. James spent the morning mucking out stalls and laying fresh straw while Evelyn gathered eggs from the protesting chickens. The physical work felt good after days of confinement, and by noon they were both red-cheeked and breathless. "Look at that," James said, pointing toward the eastern pasture where the creek cut through the snow. A small herd of deer had ventured down from the hills, their tracks dark against the white. "They'll be hungry," Evelyn said. "The snow's too deep for them to forage properly." "Nature's way. They'll manage or they won't." That's a cold philosophy. That's a realistic one. But even as he said it, she saw him studying the deer with something like sympathy. James Carter, for all his talk of practicality, had a soft heart buried under that weathered exterior. December brought more snow and temperatures that made the windows frost thick with ice. They fell into a routine born of necessity and choice: up before dawn to tend the animals, breakfast by lamplight, days spent on the endless maintenance a farm required even in winter. James repaired harnesses and sharpened tools, while Evelyn mended clothes and preserved what food she could. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire, reading aloud from her father's small collection of books, or simply talking about everything and nothing. "Tell me about the war," Evelyn said one night, curled against his side on the old sofa her mother had brought from Pennsylvania. James stiffened slightly. "That's not a pleasant topic for a winter evening." "I know, but it's part of who you are. I want to understand." He was quiet for so long she thought he might refuse. Then, slowly, he began to speak. "I enlisted in '61, right after Fort Sumter. Thought it would be a grand adventure. Put down the rebellion, save the Union, come home a hero." His voice was flat, distant. "I was 19 and stupid as hell." "You were young." "Young and stupid aren't mutually exclusive." He stared into the fire, his jaw tight. "First battle I saw was Wilson's Creek in Missouri. August heat, so hot men were dropping from it before the shooting even started. I watched boys I'd trained with get torn apart by cannon fire. Watched a man, couldn't have been more than 17, get his arm blown off and just stand there screaming until he bled out." Evelyn's hand found his, gripping tight. "Fought through Missouri, Tennessee, Mississippi. 4 years of marching and dying and trying not to think about what we were doing to each other. By the time it ended, I'd stopped feeling much of anything. Just numb, you know? Like something essential had burned out of me." "What happened to your leg?" "Shiloh. Second day. Minie ball caught me in the hip, shattered the bone. Field surgeon wanted to amputate, but my captain wouldn't let him. Said I was too valuable as a scout." James smiled without humor. "Valuable. They packed the wound with lint and whiskey and left me to heal or die. Took 6 months before I could walk properly again." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I'm one of the lucky ones. I survived. Came home with all my parts, more or less." He turned to look at her, his eyes dark with old pain. "But I left something behind in those fields, Evelyn. Some part of myself I couldn't bring back." "Maybe you found it again," she said softly. "Here. Maybe I did." They sat in silence after that, watching the fire burn down to embers. Outside, the wind howled against the house, but inside they were warm and safe and together. It was enough. Christmas came quietly. They couldn't make it to church. The roads were impassable, so they celebrated alone. Evelyn cooked a chicken and made biscuits with the last of the good flour. James surprised her with a gift he'd been working on in secret, a wooden box he'd carved and sanded smooth, with her initials worked into the lid. "For your mother's things," he explained as she ran her fingers over the careful craftsmanship. "I noticed you kept them wrapped in that old shawl. Thought they deserved something better." Tears stung her eyes. "James, it's beautiful. Not as beautiful as you." She kissed him then, pouring everything she felt into it, gratitude and love and the fierce joy of being known by someone who saw her completely. When they broke apart, she pressed her forehead to his. "I got you something too," she said, suddenly nervous. "You didn't have to." "Hush." She retrieved the package from its hiding place in the pantry and handed it to him. "Open it." Inside was a new shirt she'd sewn from fabric she'd bought on their last trip to town, dyed a deep blue that would match his eyes. James held it up, his expression soft with wonder. "Evelyn, this must have cost—" "Worth it," she said, echoing his words from months ago. "You're worth it." He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, and she felt his chest hitch with emotion he couldn't quite voice. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other, while the snow fell softly outside and the fire crackled on the hearth. January arrived bitter and brutal. The cold was so intense that water froze in the bucket overnight despite being kept inside. They burned through firewood faster than James had anticipated, and he spent days out in the woodlot, cutting and splitting logs until his hands bled through his gloves. Evelyn worried about him, about the old injury in his hip, about frostbite, about all the ways this country could kill a man who wasn't careful. "I'm fine," he insisted when she tried to make him rest. "We need the wood. We need you alive more than we need warmth. One requires the other, sweetheart." But he did rest finally, after she threatened to hide his coat. They spent that day inside playing cards and talking about plans for spring planting. James wanted to try rotating crops, plant some of the wheat fields with alfalfa to restore the soil. Evelyn suggested expanding the vegetable garden, maybe getting some fruit trees started. "We could have apples," she said, warming to the idea. "My mother always wanted an orchard." "Apples take years to bear fruit." "Then it's good we're planning to stay." James smiled at that, the expression transforming his weathered face into something younger, lighter. "Yeah, it is good." They were learning each other in all the small ways that mattered, how he liked his coffee, how she needed silence in the early morning, the way his hip ached before storms, the way she hummed while she cooked. They learned to read each other's moods, to know when to offer comfort and when to give space, to navigate the tiny conflicts that arose when two independent people tried to build a shared life. It wasn't always easy. James's tendency toward silence sometimes frustrated her, making her feel shut out of his thoughts. Her stubborn insistence on doing things her father's way sometimes clashed with his more practical suggestions. They had their first real fight in late January over something stupid, whether to sell one of the horses to raise cash for supplies. "We need the money," James said, his voice tight with frustration. "We're burning through our reserves faster than expected." "That horse was my father's. I'm not selling him." "Your father's dead, Evelyn. Sentiment doesn't keep us fed." The words hit like a slap. Evelyn felt her face go hot, anger and hurt warring in her chest. "Get out." "What?" "I said get out. Go to the barn. Sleep there. I don't want to look at you right now." James stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working. Then he grabbed his coat and walked out without another word, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Evelyn stood in the empty kitchen, shaking with rage and unshed tears. How dare he? How dare he dismiss her father's memory like it meant nothing? That horse, old Ben, had pulled the plow that broke this land, had carried her father through all his years of farming. He wasn't just livestock. He was family. She didn't sleep that night, lying rigid in bed and listening to the wind howl. Part of her wanted to go to the barn, to apologize, to make peace. But a larger part, the stubborn, wounded part, refused to be the first to bend. Dawn came gray and cold. Evelyn rose and went through the motions of making breakfast, setting the table for one. She was just pouring coffee when the door opened and James walked in, snow dusting his shoulders. "I'm sorry," he said without preamble. "You're right. Old Ben stays. We'll find another way." Evelyn set down the coffee pot carefully. "I'm sorry, too, for throwing you out." "You had cause." James shrugged off his coat, his movements stiff from cold and sleeping in the barn. "I was being an ass. Practical doesn't mean heartless, and I should have remembered that. I know we need money. I know sentiment isn't logical, but some things matter more than logic, I understand." He crossed to her, taking her cold hands in his. "We're partners, remember? That means talking through disagreements, not me making pronouncements like I'm the boss." "I was stubborn too." "You're allowed to be stubborn about things that matter to you." She pulled him close, breathing in the familiar scent of him, wood smoke and leather and home. "Don't sleep in the barn again, even if we fight, especially if we fight." "Deal." They ate breakfast together, the tension of the night before dissolving into something stronger. They'd survived their first real fight, had learned how to hurt each other and choose to heal instead. It felt important, foundational, another stone laid in the building of their marriage. February brought a brief thaw that turned the snow to slush and revealed the winter-dead grass beneath. James used the respite to check on the wheat fields, making sure the snow hadn't caused erosion or drainage problems. Evelyn accompanied him, picking her way through the mud in her father's old boots. "Look there," James said, pointing to the eastern field. "See how the snow settled unevenly? We'll need to level that out before planting or we'll get standing water." "How do we do that?" "Drag and scraper. I'll handle it come spring." He squinted at the distant tree line. "Might want to clear some of those trees too. They're blocking morning sun." Evelyn studied the land with new eyes, seeing it not as her father's legacy, but as their future. It was a subtle shift, but profound. This wasn't about preserving what had been anymore. It was about building what would be. "We should expand," she said suddenly. "Expand?" "The farm. There's unclaimed land to the west, near the river. Good soil, flat terrain. We could file a claim, add another 40 acres. James turned to look at her fully, surprise and something like pride in his expression. "That's ambitious. You said yourself we need to think ahead. More land means more crops, more income. Maybe eventually hire help. Takes capital to expand. We don't have that kind of money yet." "Not yet. But if we have a good harvest this year, if we're careful with expenses..." She trailed off, seeing the future unfold in her mind. "We could build something real, James, something lasting." He studied her for a long moment, then smiled slow and genuine. "Yeah, we could." They walked the fence lines together, making plans and dreaming aloud. It felt good to look forward instead of back, to imagine a future bright with possibility. The farm that had nearly killed her with grief and impossible work was transforming into something new. Not just her father's legacy, but their shared dream. March came in like the proverbial lion, bringing one last brutal storm that trapped them inside for nearly a week. The enforced intimacy might have driven them mad, but instead they used the time to plan. James drew sketches of possible layouts for the expanded farm. Evelyn made lists of supplies they'd need, crops they wanted to try, improvements they wanted to make. "We're really doing this," she said one evening, looking at the papers spread across the kitchen table. "Building a life here." "Having second thoughts?" "No, just amazed, I suppose. 6 months ago I thought I'd lose everything. Now I'm planning to expand. 6 months ago you were alone. Now you've got a partner." James reached across the table to take her hand. "Makes a difference." "It does." They made love that night with a tenderness that spoke of more than desire, of gratitude and commitment, and the fierce determination to protect what they'd built. Afterward, wrapped in quilts with the wind howling outside, Evelyn felt more content than she'd ever thought possible. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. It was the first time either of them had said the words aloud, though they'd been living the truth of it for months. James's arms tightened around her. "I love you too. More than I thought I could love anything. More than your father's farm? This is different. That was legacy, obligation. This..." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "This is choice. Every day I choose you, choose us, Choose this life. That makes it mean more. Evelyn turned in his arms to face him, barely able to see his features in the dim starlight filtering through the frosted window. Promise me something. Anything. Promise me we'll always choose each other, no matter how hard things get, no matter what comes. Promise me we'll fight for this. I promise, James said solemnly. Until my last breath, Evelyn. I promise. April arrived with mud and new grass pushing through the dead winter thatch. The world came alive again, birds returning, the creek running high with snowmelt, the air smelling of earth and growth. James spent long days preparing the fields for planting, the old injury in his hip protesting but holding up to the work. Evelyn worked alongside him when she could, and alone when she couldn't, feeling her body grow strong again after the soft winter months. They filed the claim on the western 40 acres, dealing with the land office bureaucracy with patience James clearly didn't feel. But the claim was approved, and suddenly they owned 100 acres of Montana territory, enough to build a real future on if they were smart and lucky in equal measure. We should celebrate, Evelyn said when the papers were finalized. How? Dinner in town. A real dinner, not hardtack and beans. So they dressed in their best clothes and rode into town, feeling wealthy and reckless and young. The hotel dining room was nearly empty on a Thursday evening, but the food was good and the company better. They held hands across the table and talked about everything, the farm, their dreams, silly memories, and serious plans all mixed together. Mrs. Carter, James said at one point, his voice formal but his eyes dancing. May I say you look exceptionally beautiful this evening? You may, Mr. Carter. Though I should warn you, flattery will get you nowhere. Nowhere? Well, perhaps somewhere. He laughed, and she loved the sound of it, free and easy, so different from the quiet, wounded man who'd first ridden onto her farm. They'd both changed, she realized. The grief and fear and desperate determination that had defined them were still there, woven into who they were, but no longer the dominant notes. They'd found something better, partnership, love, hope. On the ride home, with the stars bright overhead and the spring air cool on their faces, James started singing. It was an old ballad, something about a soldier coming home, and his voice was rough but true. Evelyn joined in on the chorus, harmonizing badly but enthusiastically. They were still singing when they turned into their lane and saw the smoke. At first Evelyn thought it was just cooking smoke from the chimney, but it was too thick, too dark. Then James was shouting, spurring the horse into a gallop, and she held on tight as they raced toward the farmyard. The barn was on fire. Flames licked up the sides, fed by the dry wood and winter-stored hay. The horses were screaming inside, high panicked sounds that cut through the night. James was off the wagon before it stopped, running toward the barn without hesitation. James, no! Evelyn scrambled down, her heart hammering. It's too dangerous. The horses! He was already yanking open the barn doors, smoke billowing out in a choking cloud. Evelyn ran to the house for blankets, soaking them in the water barrel, before running back. She couldn't see James through the smoke, could only hear the horses and pray he hadn't been overcome. Then he emerged leading Old Ben, the horse wild-eyed and fighting the lead. He shoved the rope into her hands. Get him clear. I'm going back for the others. James! But he was already gone, disappeared back into the smoke and flame. Evelyn dragged Old Ben away from the barn, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her face from smoke and fear. She tied him to the fence and ran back just as James emerged with another horse, then disappeared again. 3 times he went in. 3 times he came out. On the 4th time, he didn't come out. James! Evelyn screamed. She started toward the barn, but the heat drove her back. James! Then he was there, stumbling out with the milk cow lowing in terror, his face black with soot and his clothes smoking. He collapsed as soon as he got the cow clear, coughing so hard he couldn't breathe. Evelyn threw the wet blanket over him, smothering the embers on his clothes, her hands frantic. You fool, you complete fool, you could have died. The animals, he gasped, had to hell with the animals. You matter more than livestock, you stubborn, brave, idiotic man. She was crying now, holding him as he coughed and wheezed. Don't you ever do that again. Don't you dare. Okay, he managed. Okay. They sat in the mud and watched the barn burn, their arms around each other. There was nothing to do but let it go. No well close enough, no pump strong enough to fight a fire that size. By dawn, only the stone foundation remained, still smoking in the gray light. They'd saved all the animals, lost everything else. The tools, the harnesses, the stored hay and grain they'd saved for spring planting. The barn her grandfather had built was gone, but they were alive, battered and exhausted and covered in soot, but alive. "We'll rebuild," James said hoarsely, his voice raw from smoke. "Bigger and better." Evelyn wanted to ask how, wanted to point out that they had no money for rebuilding, that this disaster had just wiped out any hope of expanding or hiring help or doing anything but surviving. But looking at his face, determined and defiant despite the exhaustion, she found herself nodding. "Yes, we will." Because that's what they did. They survived, they fought, they chose each other and this life, no matter what the cost. The sun rose over the ruins, painting the sky pink and gold. Evelyn leaned against James's shoulder, bone-tired but unbowed, and watched the light spread across their land. They'd lost the battle, but not the war. The farm still stood. They still stood, and that was enough to start again. The news of the fire spread through the valley faster than the flames themselves had consumed the barn. By mid-morning, Martin Brennan arrived with his wagon loaded with hay and grain, Dorothy beside him with baskets of food. They took one look at the smoking ruins and the soot-blackened couple sitting exhausted in the yard, and set to work without a word. Within hours, more neighbors appeared. The Hendersons brought lumber salvaged from an old shed they'd been meaning to tear down. The Petersons arrived with tools, hammers and saws and boxes of nails. Even Mrs. Whitmore, the stern widow who'd clucked her tongue disapprovingly at Evelyn's hasty marriage, showed up with two of her sons and a determination to help that brooked no argument. "This is what we do," Martin said simply when James tried to protest, tried to say they couldn't accept charity. "You'd do the same for any of us." Would they have? Evelyn wasn't sure. A year ago, she'd been so wrapped up in her own grief and fear that she couldn't have seen past her own problems. But James nodded, accepting the help with a grace that made her love him even more. "Thank you," he said, his voice still rough from smoke. "We won't forget this." They worked through that day and into the next, a dozen men and women coming together to raise a new barn on the bones of the old one. It wouldn't be as large or as fine as what her grandfather had built. That would take time and money they didn't have. But it would be functional. 4 walls, a roof, enough room for the animals, and some storage. Evelyn worked alongside the women, cooking massive quantities of food to feed the workers. Her kitchen became a hive of activity, with Dorothy directing traffic and the other women chopping vegetables and stirring pots and trading gossip that somehow felt less judgmental than it had before. It was as if the fire had burned away the last of the community's reservations about the Carters, leaving only the bedrock truth that they were neighbors who'd proven themselves through hard work and determination. "Your husband nearly died saving those animals," Mrs. Henderson said while kneading bread dough with flour up to her elbows. "That's the mark of a good man, caring about what's his." "He's stubborn," Evelyn replied, but her voice was warm with pride. "Stubborn's what this country requires," Mrs. Whitmore said tartly. "The weak don't last out here. You two will do just fine." By the third day, the barn stood, rough and new-smelling of fresh-cut lumber, but solid. James climbed to the roof to nail down the last shingles, and when he drove in the final nail, the gathered crowd cheered. It was a small sound, just 24 voices, but it echoed across the valley like a promise. That night, after everyone had gone home and they were alone again with their animals safely sheltered, Evelyn and James stood in the doorway of the new barn and surveyed their work. "It's smaller than the old one," James observed. "It's perfect. We lost months of work, the tools, the harnesses, the seed grain we'd stored. We'll manage." Evelyn took his hand, weaving their fingers together. "We always do." James pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. She could feel the exhaustion in him, the bone-deep weariness of 3 days of brutal work on top of nearly dying in a fire. But she could also feel something else, a quiet strength, an unshakable determination. "How'd the fire start?" he asked. "I've been thinking about it. We were careful with the lanterns, never left them burning unattended. Does it matter? Might. If it was deliberate, why would anyone deliberately burn our barn? James was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, but I'd like to rule it out. The next morning, he examined the ruins more carefully, sifting through ash and charred wood with a methodical patience that spoke of hard-learned lessons. Evelyn watched from the porch, unease growing in her chest. She didn't want to believe that someone in their valley, their community, could have done such a thing. But James's expression grew darker as he worked, and when he finally came to the house, his face was grim. Well? She asked. Found what's left of a kerosene can. Wasn't ours. Ours are all accounted for, stored in the shed. He held up a twisted piece of metal. Someone poured accelerant along the north wall. This wasn't an accident, Evelyn. Her blood ran cold. Who would? I don't know, but I intend to find out. They rode into town the following day to speak with the territorial marshal, a weathered man named Hawkins, who listened to their story with the skeptical expression of someone who'd heard too many wild accusations. But when James showed him the remains of the kerosene can and explained where he'd found it, Hawkins's demeanor shifted. You got enemies? He asked bluntly. Not that I know of, James replied. What about you, Mrs. Carter? Anyone with a grudge against your family? Evelyn thought about it, running through the limited list of people she knew well enough to inspire that kind of hatred. No, we kept to ourselves mostly. My father had debts, but we paid them off after the harvest. Paid them off completely? Yes. Why? Hawkins scratched his chin thoughtfully. Sometimes men don't like it when debts get settled. Means they lose leverage, lose control. Who'd your father owe money to? The bank mostly. Mr. Wilkins held the note on our seed loan. Anyone else? There was a man in Billings, a private lender my father borrowed from before I... Evelyn paused, a cold understanding dawning. Marcus Thornton. He loaned Papa $200 5 years ago at terrible terms. We paid it back with interest after the wheat sold. How terrible were the terms? 30% interest compounded annually. Papa was desperate that year. The bank had refused him and the crop was already in the ground. Mr. Thornton was the only option. Hawkins and James exchanged a look that made Evelyn's stomach clench. Thornton, Hawkins said slowly, is known for keeping people in debt. He doesn't like it when they get free and clear. Cuts into his business model. You think he burned our barn? Evelyn's voice came out sharp with disbelief. To what purpose? We already paid him. He can't collect on a satisfied debt. No, but he can make an example. Show other debtors what happens when you manage to escape his terms. Hawkins stood, reaching for his hat. I'll look into it. Meanwhile, you two watch yourselves. If Thornton's involved, this might not be the end of your troubles. They rode home in tense silence, each lost in dark thoughts. The idea that someone would deliberately try to destroy them, not out of personal hatred but cold financial calculation, was more terrifying than any natural disaster. Fire and frost and failed crops were dangers they understood, could prepare for. But malice? That was something else entirely. We should be armed, James said that evening as they secured the animals for the night. I've got my rifle, but you should know how to shoot too. I know how to shoot. Papa taught me. Good. Keep the shotgun loaded by the door, and from now on we don't leave the place unattended. One of us stays here at all times. Evelyn wanted to argue, wanted to say he was being paranoid, but the memory of those flames and James's smoke-damaged lungs kept her silent. If someone wanted to hurt them, they needed to be ready. The next week passed in uneasy vigilance. They took turns watching at night, sleeping in shifts, jumping at every unusual sound. The spring planting couldn't wait, though, and James spent long days in the fields, turning soil and laying seed, while Evelyn kept watch from the house, the shotgun never far from hand. Martin Brennan stopped by midweek with news. Hawkins was asking around about Marcus Thornton. Seems he's been in the area, staying at the hotel in Billings. No proof he's connected to your fire, but the timing's suspicious. What can we do about it? Evelyn asked. Not much without evidence, but folks are watching now. If Thornton or any of his men show their faces around here, word will spread fast. It was small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. They weren't alone in this. The same community that had helped rebuild their barn was now looking out for threats. That night, As they lay in bed, James spoke into the darkness. We could leave. Sell the farm. Head to California like I originally planned. Start fresh where no one knows us. Is that what you want? I want you safe. Everything else is secondary. Evelyn rolled over to face him, barely able to make out his features in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. James Carter, listen to me. We don't run. Not from fire, not from threats, not from men like Marcus Thornton. This is our land, our home. We fought too hard to build it to just walk away. Even if staying puts you in danger? Especially then. Because running wouldn't make us safe. It would just make us homeless and scared. She pressed her palm to his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her hand. We stand, together, whatever comes. He covered her hand with his, holding it tight. You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything. Then we stand. May arrived with sunshine and new growth pushing through the black earth. The wheat seeds James had planted began to sprout, tiny green shoots that represented their entire future. They nursed each field carefully, watching for signs of disease or pest damage, praying for rain but not too much, for sun but not too hot. The work was endless and exhausting, but there was joy in it too. Watching something grow that they'd planted together, seeing the results of their labor take root, it felt like proof that they could build something lasting, despite everything trying to destroy it. On a warm afternoon in mid-May, Evelyn was working in the vegetable garden when she heard hoofbeats. She straightened, reaching instinctively for the shotgun she'd taken to keeping nearby, and watched as 3 riders approached the house. They weren't neighbors. She could tell from the way they sat their horses, too casual, too confident, like men who were used to being unwelcome and didn't care. The one in front was well-dressed by frontier standards, his suit expensive and his boots polished. Marcus Thornton, she realized with a jolt of recognition. She'd met him once, years ago, when her father had first taken the loan. James emerged from the field, still carrying the hoe he'd been using, his expression hardening as he took in the visitors. Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, Thornton said pleasantly, as if this were a social call. Fine day, isn't it? State your business, James replied flatly. Direct. I like that. Thornton smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I'm here to discuss a business proposition. I'm buying up land in this valley, consolidating holdings. I'd like to purchase your farm. It's not for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price. I'm prepared to offer you $3,000. That's quite generous, considering your recent troubles. $3,000 was nearly double what the land was worth, and they all knew it. It was the kind of offer designed to tempt, to make them question their resolve. Not interested, Evelyn said firmly, moving to stand beside James. Mrs. Carter, please be reasonable. This is rough country, dangerous even. Fires happen, accidents happen. A woman and her husband alone on a remote farm, why, anything could happen to them. The threat was barely veiled, hanging in the air like smoke. James's knuckles went white on the hoe handle, but his voice remained steady. Get off our land. Now, there's no need for hostility. I said get off our land now, before I make you. Thornton's smile faded, replaced by something cold and calculating. You're making a mistake, Carter. I always get what I want, one way or another. Think about my offer. You have until the end of the month to accept. After that, he shrugged eloquently. Well, accidents become more likely. He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his 2 companions following. They didn't look back. Evelyn realized she was shaking. He admitted it. He basically admitted to burning the barn. Yeah, and we still can't prove it. James set down the hoe carefully, as if afraid he might throw it. But now we know for certain, this isn't over. They rode into town the next day and told Marshal Hawkins everything. He listened grimly, taking notes, but his expression told them what they already knew. Threats weren't the same as evidence. I'll talk to Thornton, Hawkins said. Make it clear he's being watched. But unless we catch him in the act or find witnesses willing to testify, my hands are tied. The law requires proof. So we just wait for him to try something else? Evelyn demanded, frustration making her voice sharp. You protect yourselves. Stay armed, stay alert, and document everything. If Thornton or his men so much as set foot on your property again, you send for me immediately. It was inadequate, but it was all they had. The rest of May passed in tense waiting. They maintained their vigilance, sleeping in shifts, watching the roads, treating every sound as a potential threat. The strain wore on them both. Evelyn grew jumpy and exhausted, while James became quieter, more withdrawn, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. But nothing happened. No more fires, no more threats, no sign of Thornton or his men. It was almost worse than an attack would have been. The not knowing, the constant anticipation, the feeling that they were waiting for an axe to fall. Maybe he gave up, Evelyn suggested one evening as they watched the sun set from the porch. Maybe he realized we won't scare easily and decided to move on. Maybe, James said, but he didn't sound convinced. June brought the first real heat of summer and relief from the constant fear. Weeks passed with no sign of trouble, and gradually they began to relax their guard. The wheat was growing tall and green, promising a good harvest. The vegetable garden was producing more than they could eat. The new barn was fully functional, and they'd even managed to replace most of the tools they'd lost in the fire. Life, slowly, began to feel normal again. "I think we might actually make it," Evelyn said one morning, surveying their land with something like wonder. "Despite everything, the fire, the threats, all of it, I think we're going to be okay." James pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "More than okay. Look at what we've built." And it was something to look at. The field stretched golden green in the morning sun. The house stood solid and welcoming. The new barn gleamed with fresh paint they'd managed to afford with careful budgeting. It wasn't perfect, wasn't grand, but it was theirs. They'd fought for every inch of it, had earned it with blood and sweat and stubborn determination. That afternoon, Dorothy Brennan stopped by with news and a knowing smile. "I heard something interesting in town yesterday. Marcus Thornton's been having financial troubles. Seems several of his investments went bad, and he's having to liquidate assets. Word is he's leaving Montana, heading back east." Evelyn felt a weight she hadn't known she was carrying lift from her shoulders. "He's leaving? For good?" "That's what they say. Something about a railway deal that collapsed. He lost a fortune." Dorothy's smile widened. "I thought you'd want to know." After she left, Evelyn and James stood in the yard processing this gift of unexpected reprieve. "We won," Evelyn said wonderingly. "We actually won." "We survived," James corrected gently. "That's all we ever needed to do." But it felt like more than survival. It felt like victory, hard-earned and well-deserved. That night they celebrated with the last bottle of whiskey her father had kept for special occasions, sitting on the porch and watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The night was warm and full of the sounds of summer, crickets singing, the creek running high with mountain runoff, the horses moving peacefully in the pasture. "Tell me something," Evelyn said, pleasantly buzzed from whiskey and relief. "If you could go back to that day you first rode onto this farm, would you still stop?" James considered the question seriously as he considered everything. "Yeah, I would. Even knowing everything that was coming, the work, the fire, the threats, especially knowing all that, because it led to this, to us, to this life." He turned to look at her, his eyes warm in the lamplight. "Every hard thing we've faced has just proven what we already knew. We're stronger together than we ever were alone." Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes, happy tears this time, tears of gratitude and love and bone-deep relief. "I'm glad you stopped. Glad you stayed. Nowhere else I'd rather be." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, feeling the solid earth beneath them and the equally solid presence of each other. The future stretched out before them, uncertain but no longer frightening. They'd faced the worst the Montana Territory could throw at them and survived. More than survived, they'd thrived. The wheat was growing, the farm was secure. They had each other. It was enough. It was everything. As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, they went inside together, leaving the empty whiskey bottle on the porch and the troubles of the past where they belonged, behind them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new reasons to be grateful for strong backs and stubborn hearts. But tonight was for rest, for holding each other close, for whispering promises in the darkness and believing in the life they were building. One day at a time, one season at a time, together, always together. Summer deepened across the Montana Territory, bringing with it the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the wheat fields and turned the creek into a lazy ribbon of cool relief. Evelyn found herself rising earlier each morning, trying to get the hardest work done before the sun climbed too high. James did the same, and they'd often meet for breakfast covered in sweat and dust, grinning at each other like conspirators who'd stolen something precious from the dawn. The wheat was doing better than either of them had dared hope. The stalks stood tall and thick, their heads heavy with grain that would soon be ready for harvest. James walked the fields every evening, running his hands over the wheat like a father checking on sleeping children, and Evelyn could see the pride in his face when he thought she wasn't looking. "Another week," he announced one night at dinner. "Maybe two, then we start cutting." "We'll need help this time," Evelyn said. "Even with both of us working, 60 acres is too much, and we've got the new 40 acres planted too." "I know, I was thinking we could hire some of the younger Brennan boys. And maybe that Swedish fellow who's been working Peterson's place. Martin says he's good with a scythe." "That'll cost money." "Good harvest will more than cover it." James reached across the table to take her hand. "We're not alone anymore, Evelyn. We don't have to do everything ourselves." It was a lesson they'd both learned the hard way, she realized. The fire had taught them that accepting help wasn't weakness, and offering it wasn't charity. It was just what people did when they lived in a place hard enough to require cooperation for survival. The next Sunday after church, they talked to Martin about hiring help for the harvest. He nodded approvingly and suggested 3 of his sons: Tom, who was 19 and strong as an ox; David, 17 and quick with tools; and young Michael, barely 15 but eager to prove himself. "They'll work hard for you," Martin promised, "and they need the experience. Won't always be my land they're working." They also hired Lars Anderson, the Swedish immigrant Martin had mentioned. He was a quiet man in his 40s who'd come west after his wife died, looking for a fresh start. His English was rough, but his work ethic was legendary, and when James showed him the fields, Lars nodded with the satisfied expression of someone who recognized quality wheat when he saw it. "Good crop," he said in his heavily accented English. "Very good. We bring in together, yeah?" "Yeah," James agreed, smiling. With the help secured, Evelyn turned her attention to preparations. She'd need to feed 5 extra mouths 3 times a day for weeks. That meant planning meals, preserving extra vegetables from the garden, making arrangements with the butcher in town for meat they couldn't provide themselves. It was a massive undertaking, but she approached it with the same determination she'd brought to everything else. Dorothy Brennan and some of the other women offered to help with the cooking, a gesture that would have seemed intrusive a year ago, but now felt like simple kindness. Evelyn accepted gratefully, and soon her kitchen was full of activity most mornings, women talking and laughing while they chopped vegetables and mixed dough, the kind of communal work that had sustained prairie communities since the first settlers arrived. "You've changed," Dorothy observed one morning while they were rolling out pie crusts. "When I first met you, you were so determined to do everything yourself. Now look at you, accepting help like it's the most natural thing in the world." "I learned it from James," Evelyn admitted. "He showed me that letting people help isn't the same as admitting defeat. That man's good for you." "He's the best thing that ever happened to me," Dorothy smiled knowingly. "I can see that. The way you two look at each other, it reminds me of Martin and me when we were first married. All that fire and determination pointed in the same direction." The harvest began on the first Monday of August, when the wheat had turned from green to gold and the grain came away from the chaff with a satisfying crunch when you rubbed it between your fingers. They started early, before the sun was fully up, working in the relative cool of morning. James and Lars led the cutting, their scythes moving in perfect rhythm. The Brennan boys followed, gathering the cut wheat into sheaves and tying them with practiced efficiency. Evelyn worked alongside them, her hands remembering the motions from last year, though this time there was laughter and conversation instead of desperate silence. By noon, they'd cleared nearly 3 acres, a pace that would have seemed miraculous last year. They broke for dinner, a massive spread of food that the women had prepared and brought out to the field, and ate in the shade of the wagon, too hungry and tired for much conversation. "Your father would be proud," Martin said to Evelyn as they were preparing to return to work. "This is a hell of a crop. James deserves the credit. He's the one who knew how to manage it properly. Takes two, James interjected, overhearing. Your father left good land and good equipment. I just helped make use of it. They worked through the afternoon and into the early evening, stopping only when the light grew too dim to cut safely. By then they'd cleared nearly 8 acres, and everyone was exhausted but satisfied. The Brennan boys headed home with promises to return at dawn. Lars accepted Evelyn's offer to sleep in the barn rather than make the long ride back to Peterson's place each night. That became the pattern for the next 3 weeks. Up before dawn, work until dark, fall into bed too tired to do anything but sleep. It was brutal and exhausting and somehow also exhilarating. The satisfaction of watching the fields transform from standing wheat to neat rows of stacked sheaves, knowing that each one represented food, an income, and another year secured. Midway through the second week, Evelyn realized she'd missed her monthly courses. She didn't mention it to James, not yet, not when they were both so focused on the harvest. But the knowledge sat warm and secret in her chest, a possibility that made her smile even through the exhaustion. The weather held clear and hot, perfect for harvest, but punishing for the workers. They went through gallons of water each day, and Evelyn made sure there was always lemonade or switchel to keep everyone drinking. James's old injury acted up toward the end of the second week, and she could see him favoring his left side, but he refused to slow down. We're too close, he said when she tried to make him rest. Another week, and we'll have it all in. He was right. By the end of the third week, all 100 acres had been cut and stacked, the sheaves drying in the late summer sun. They'd lost only 1 day to rain, a brief thunderstorm that had everyone scrambling to cover what they could, but otherwise the harvest had gone as smoothly as anyone could hope. On the last day, after the final sheaf was tied and stacked, the whole crew stood in the field and looked at what they'd accomplished. 100 acres of wheat, all safely harvested. It was more than Evelyn's father had ever managed alone, more than she'd thought possible when James first rode onto her farm. We did it, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You did it, Lars corrected in his careful English. You and husband. We just help. That night they had a celebration dinner at the house. Everyone who'd helped with the harvest, plus their families. The kitchen table couldn't hold everyone, so they ate outside. Makeshift tables set up in the yard, lanterns hung from tree branches providing light as the sun set. There was roasted chicken and fresh bread and vegetables from the garden, pie and coffee, and Martin's homemade beer that was stronger than it tasted. Someone brought a fiddle, and someone else a harmonica, and soon there was music filling the warm night air. The Brennan boys taught Evelyn a Swedish dance that Lars showed them, and she laughed until her sides hurt as James tried gamely to follow along, his bad leg making the steps awkward, but his enthusiasm making up for it. Thank you, she said to everyone when the music finally wound down and people were preparing to leave. All of you. We couldn't have done this without your help. That's what neighbors do, Dorothy said simply, and everyone nodded agreement. After they'd all gone and the yard was quiet again, Evelyn and James stood together looking at their fields. The stubble gleamed silver in the moonlight, and the stacks of wheat cast long shadows across the ground. James, Evelyn said softly, I have something to tell you. He turned to look at her, concern flickering across his face. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Nothing at all. She took his hand and placed it on her belly. I think I'm pregnant. For a long moment he just stood there, his hand warm against her stomach, his expression unreadable. Then his face split into a grin so wide it looked like it might crack his weathered features. You're sure? Not completely, but I'm late, and I've been feeling strange in the mornings, and... She laughed, nervous and happy all at once. I think so. Yes. James pulled her close, holding her like she was made of something precious and fragile. A baby, he whispered. We're going to have a baby. Are you happy about it? Happy. He pulled back to look at her face. Evelyn, I never thought I'd have this. A home, a wife, a family. I thought I'd burned that chance when I left my father's farm. His voice roughened with emotion. This is everything I didn't know I wanted. They held each other as the stars came out, making plans and dreaming aloud about the future. Would it be a boy or a girl? What would they name it? When would it arrive? February? Maybe March? We'll need to add on to the house, James said, already planning. Make a proper nursery and get a cradle. I can build one over the winter. One thing at a time, Evelyn laughed. First, let's get the wheat sold and make sure we can afford to feed ourselves. The threshing took another 2 weeks, but with the hired help it went faster than last year. They worked the thresher in shifts, filling sack after sack with golden grain. When Mr. Patterson came up from Billings to inspect the wheat, his eyes widened at the quantity. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Carter, this is exceptional, both the quality and the amount. He ran his hands through a sample, checking for moisture and impurities. I can offer you top price. This is some of the finest wheat I've seen this year. The final sale brought in nearly $5,000, more money than Evelyn had seen in her entire life. After paying the workers and settling their debts for supplies and equipment, they still had enough left to see them comfortably through the winter with plenty to spare for spring planting. We're not just surviving anymore, Evelyn said, staring at the bank book that showed their new balance. We're actually doing well. Your father's dream, James said softly. He wanted this land to provide for his family. Now it is. They used some of the money to finally file the official paperwork for the western 40 acres, making it legally theirs. They bought new tools to replace what had been lost in the fire, and a few small luxuries, a new dress for Evelyn, a good saddle for James, books they'd both been wanting. James also bought lumber and started work on the addition to the house, framing out a room that would eventually become a nursery. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color in the aspens up in the hills. The farm settled into its quieter rhythm, but it was a peaceful quiet now, not the desperate silence of survival. They had succeeded. Against all odds, against fire and threats and the punishing difficulty of Montana farming, they had built something lasting. One afternoon in late September, almost exactly a year since James had first ridden onto the farm, they took a walk down to the creek. The water ran clear and cool, and they sat on the flat rock where they'd sat that first time, when they were still learning to trust each other. Do you ever think about leaving? Evelyn asked. Going west like you originally planned? James was quiet for a moment, watching the water flow past. Sometimes I think about it. Wonder what California's like. What might have happened if I'd kept riding that day instead of stopping. Do you regret stopping? Not for a second. He turned to look at her, his eyes warm with certainty. This is where I was meant to be. With you. Building this life. Even though it's been hard? Especially because it's been hard. Easy things don't mean much, but this, he gestured at the land around them, the farm they'd fought to keep. This we earned. Every acre, every harvest, every moment of it. Evelyn leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady strength that had saved her farm and her heart. My father's last words were about the wheat. He made me promise not to let the land die. You kept that promise. We kept it, together. She placed his hand on her belly, where their child was growing. And now we're making something new. Not just preserving what was, but creating what will be. Winter came early that year, with the first snow falling in mid-October. But they were ready for it. The house was warm and well-stocked. The animals were sheltered in the sturdy barn. The root cellar was full, the smokehouse was packed, and they had money in the bank for anything they might need. More importantly, they had each other. James finished the nursery in November, building a beautiful cradle from oak he'd saved from the old barn. Evelyn sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands already practiced from years of mending, but her heart full of a tenderness she'd never felt before. They spent the long winter evenings talking about the future, making plans for when their family would grow from 2 to 3. Christmas came again, their second as husband and wife. This time they made it to church, the roads clear enough for travel. Evelyn was showing now, her belly rounded with pregnancy, and the whole community seemed to share in their joy. Women offered advice and hand-me-down baby clothes. Men clapped James on the back and made jokes about sleepless nights ahead. You two have become quite the success story, Reverend Matthews said after the service. Last year at this time, people were wondering if you'd make it through the winter. Now look at you, prosperous, expecting a child, respected members of the community. We had a lot of help, Evelyn said. You had determination. The help came because people recognized that and wanted to support it. The Reverend smiled. Your father would be very proud, my dear. On the ride home, with snow falling softly and the horse's breath steaming in the cold air, Evelyn reflected on how much had changed. A year and a half ago, she'd been alone and terrified, trying to harvest impossible fields with bleeding hands and a broken heart. She'd made a promise to a dying man and hadn't known if she could keep it. Now she sat beside her husband in a wagon full of Christmas gifts and good wishes, carrying their child, heading back to a farm that was thriving. The land hadn't died. Neither had she. Instead, they'd all transformed into something new and vital and full of possibility. "What are you thinking?" James asked, noticing her faraway expression. "That I'm grateful for all of it, even the hard parts, because they led to this." "No regrets?" "Not a single one." The baby came in late February during a howling blizzard that trapped them in the house for 3 days. Dorothy Brennan and the midwife, Mrs. Chen, had both made it to the farm just before the worst of the storm hit, settling in to wait with the practiced patience of women who'd delivered many babies in difficult conditions. The labor was long and hard, testing Evelyn's strength in ways even the harvest hadn't. But James never left her side, holding her hand through every contraction, whispering encouragement when she was sure she couldn't go on. "You're the strongest person I know," he said during one particularly brutal contraction. "You brought in 60 acres of wheat alone. You survived a barn fire and threats and everything this country could throw at you. You can do this." And she did. As dawn broke on the third day of the storm, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that seemed to challenge the wind howling outside. She was small and perfect, with dark hair like Evelyn's and what promised to be James's blue eyes. "Sarah," Evelyn whispered, naming her daughter after her mother. "Sarah Catherine Carter." James held his daughter with shaking hands, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Hello, little one. Welcome to the world." Dorothy and Mrs. Chen cleaned up efficiently, then left the new family alone to bond. Outside, the storm was finally breaking, and weak sunlight filtered through the frost-covered windows. "She's perfect," James said, unable to look away from his daughter's tiny face. "She is." Evelyn felt exhausted and exhilarated and overwhelmed all at once. "We made her. Out of nothing but love and determination, we made this perfect little person." "We made more than that," James said softly. "We made a life. A real life with roots and purpose and a future." He was right. The farm that had nearly destroyed Evelyn with grief and impossible work had transformed into something miraculous. A home, a livelihood, a legacy to pass on to their daughter and whatever children might follow. The wheat fields her father had loved so much would continue to provide, season after season, generation after generation. Spring arrived eventually, as it always did in Montana. The snow melted, the creek ran high, and the land came alive again with new growth. They planted their fields with Sarah sleeping in a basket at the edge of the field, taking turns to watch her while the other worked. The community continued to support them, now treating the Carters not as outsiders who'd lucked into success, but as established members who'd proven themselves through hard work and perseverance. Martin Brennan's sons asked James for advice on crop rotation. Other farmers came to see his techniques for field management. Evelyn found herself hosting gatherings of farm wives, sharing recipes and child-rearing advice with women who'd once viewed her with suspicion. They'd become part of the valley's fabric, woven into the community through shared labor and mutual respect. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching Sarah play on a blanket in the grass, James turned to Evelyn with a thoughtful expression. "You remember that first day when I asked what you could pay me and you said nothing? I remember. You said you'd take faith as payment." "I was lying," he admitted with a slight smile. "I didn't have faith. Not in myself, not in the future, not in much of anything. I'd lost that somewhere in the war or in the years after. I said it because it sounded good, because I thought it might convince you to let me stay." "James, let me finish." He took her hand, his callous thumb rubbing across her knuckles. "I didn't have faith then, but you did. You had enough faith for both of us. You believed you could keep your promise to your father, believed this farm could survive, believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Your faith carried us through that first harvest and the fire and everything else." "You gave me faith too," Evelyn said softly. When I was drowning in work and grief, you showed up and helped me believe that tomorrow could be better than today. Then I guess we saved each other. I guess we did. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their daughter discover the world with small, wondering hands. The wheat in the fields was already knee-high, promising another good harvest. The barn stood solid and proud. The house, expanded now with the nursery addition, was full of life and laughter and love. The past year and a half had transformed everything. The desperate, grieving woman who'd made an impossible promise to her dying father had become a successful farmer, a wife, a mother. The wounded drifter looking to escape his past had found a home, a purpose, a reason to stay in one place and build instead of running. They'd started as two broken people brought together by necessity and desperation. They'd become partners through shared labor and mutual respect. And finally, they'd become something more, a family, a team, two halves of a whole that was stronger than either could have been alone. "I love you," Evelyn said, the words as natural as breathing. "I love you too," James replied. "More than I ever thought possible." Sarah made a happy burbling sound, as if agreeing with her parents. They laughed together, the sound carrying across the fields they'd fought so hard to keep. The Montana Territory stretched around them, beautiful and harsh in equal measure. The mountains stood eternal in the distance. The prairie rolled on forever, full of promise and possibility, and the endless work required to make a life in hard country. But they were ready for it. Together, they could face anything, drought or flood, fire or frost, whatever challenges the land and the years might bring. They'd proven that already, had earned their place through determination and love, and the simple act of choosing each other, day after day, no matter what came. The sun set over their land, painting the wheat fields gold and crimson. Evelyn leaned against James's shoulder, feeling his steady heartbeat, watching their daughter play, and felt a contentment so deep it made her throat tight with gratitude. They'd finished her father's harvest, but more than that, they'd planted their own, and it was growing, season by season, year by year, into something more beautiful than either of them had dared to dream. The cowboy who'd stopped to help had found his home. The woman who'd made an impossible promise had kept it and gained everything in return. Under the wide Montana sky, in the fields they'd fought to save, love had taken root and flourished. And that was the real harvest, the one that would sustain them through all the seasons yet to come. The two eats www.youtube.com/watch VFCOC. Title: The Cowboy Who Finished Her Father's Harvest. Chapter 1. Opening: The Last Promise. Montana Territory, 1876. When Evelyn Harrow held her dying father's hand, his final words weren't about heaven. They were about wheat. "Don't let the land die, Evelyn. Promise me." She did. But as the autumn wind howled over the uncut fields, one woman alone couldn't save a farm. Her hands bled from the scythe, her back ached, yet she refused to stop. Then, one dusty afternoon, a rider appeared through the golden stalks. A lean, quiet man with a limp and kind eyes. James Carter, a cowboy looking for work. "I can't pay you," Evelyn said. "Then I'll take faith as payment," he replied, and set down his saddlebag. 2. Rising Action. Two against the prairie. Together, they fought the sun, the wind, and exhaustion. He swung the cradle scythe in even rhythm. She tied the sheaves. At night they ate by lantern light, too tired to speak. James slept in the barn, his low whistle drifting through the dark like a lullaby. The neighbors whispered, a lone woman and a drifter. But Evelyn didn't care. For the first time since her father's death, the house didn't echo. One evening, rain threatened, and James worked through the pain in his leg until he collapsed. Evelyn hauled him to the porch, cursing the sky. He smiled weakly. "You fight harder than half the men I've known." 3. Climax. The storm and the confession. Lightning split the prairie. The wind tore tarps from the wheat stacks. James dragged himself outside, refusing to let her lose the crop. Together they battled the storm until the last bundle was saved. Soaked and shaking, they took shelter in the barn. Evelyn pressed his torn hand to her heart. "You fool," she whispered. "You could have died." "Worth it," he said. "I gave up on roots years ago. Maybe I found them here." 4. Resolution. The field complete. By sunrise, the sky cleared. Evelyn stood beside James, staring at the stubble that shimmered gold in the morning light. "It's done," he said simply, the same words her father would have spoken. Tears blurred her eyes. The harvest was saved, but so was something larger, her faith in tomorrow. 5. Breakthrough and ending. The new season. Weeks later, when the wheat sold high, Evelyn paid the debts and kept the farm. She asked James if he'd still go west. He looked toward the horizon, then back at her. "Ma'am, I think West found me." She smiled, took his calloused hand, and said, "Then let's start planting for next year." Under the same wide sky that had once buried her in sorrow, two hearts began again, proof that even in the hardest soil, love can take root.